and welcome to our 12th lecture within the Fine Art Lecture Series with Grant Kester today. For those who are here for the first time, the series of public talks is organized by the Innovative Training Network FEINART. The acronym FEINART stands for the Future of European Independent Art Spaces in a Period of Socially Engaged Art. And this PhD training program is jointly led by the Universities of Wolverhampton, Zeppelin University, University of Iceland, and University of Edinburgh. And it receives its funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie grant. So before I introduce Grant Kester, just some formal remarks. As you may have already realized, this lecture will be recorded. And if you want to ask question, please raise your hand. There is a button on the right with this hand, and you can simply raise it, or you can also type into the chat if you want. And please mute yourself as long as Grant is speaking. Yeah, from social sculpture to art-related action, a symposium on socially engaged art was the symposium where I first met Grant Kester. We invited him actually, and Grant is professor of art history and at the visual arts department at the University of California, San Diego, and the founding editor of Field, a journal of socially engaged art criticism. His publications include Art, Activism, and Oppositionality, essays on afterimage, and conversation pieces, community and communication in modern art. And I would say one of the main books within and the most influential books, I would say, in the field of socially engaged art, called The One and the Many, Contemporary Collaborative Art in a Global Context. He has recently completed work on collective situations, dialogues on contemporary Latin American art from 1995 to 2010, an anthology of writings by art collectives working in Latin America. And his current book project is Autonomy and Answerability, so the same title as his lecture. It will become a 2-volume book and reflects upon autonomy. What I really appreciate about Grant is that he has always been concerned with a post-colonial perspective on art. This shows, for example, that there's hardly a book that does not focus on projects from different continents. And what I like as well is that he is someone who does not fall prey to the logic of his own discourse dynamics. He always takes a kind of meta perspective on the canonization processes and questions these canonization processes, for example, with the concept of what he calls orthopedic aesthetics, or his observation on citation cartels. I really like that. His book on The One and the Many is a real milestone in the debate of socially engaged art, and yet full of self-criticism about his own position. Yeah, and his field journal is a fantastic query from which one can learn about discourses, projects, and debates from the most diverse perspectives from all over the world. In this respect, it is one of the most important work resources also for our project. And therefore, we are really extremely happy to have him here tonight. And Grant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to Karen and John for the invitation as well. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you, even if it's just remotely. So yeah, I'll get started, and this is just a shortish discussion of some recent projects that are drawn from this book. Two-volume book on autonomy I've been working on. So I'll just give a little snapshot of some of that more contemporary research. So let me, without further ado, I'll get started. This is a Louise Chemnitzer quote from 1969, an essay on colonialism and contemporary art in 1969 that I wanted to begin with. New elements begin to appear, as Louise Chemnitzer observed over a half century ago, when we move from an art practice predicated on object-based mediation to art that is defined through what he calls a situational engagement with the world beyond the gallery of the museum. In this talk, I'll focus on three related questions. First, what modes of political transformation are implicit in socially engaged art practice, and how do they relate to the model of revolutionary change that informs a more, a more conventional avant-garde orientation? Second, how does socially engaged art practice establish a form of critical mediation in its relationship to the social and political world? That is, how is autonomy produced differently in this work? And third, how does engaged art catalyze critical self-reflection? That is, how does it contribute to the prefigurative process of creative self-transformation that we associate with the aesthetic through its relationship to praxis? In the traditions of vanguard politics, an emancipatory self-transformation will only come to fruition after the violent work of revolution is complete. For example, in the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat developed by Lenin in the post-revolutionary period. Until then, revolutionary praxis is an entirely instrumental affair, predicated on rigid hierarchies and the subordination of the individual to the vanguard leader. In the avant-garde tradition of aesthetic autonomy associated with figures such as Adorno, self-transformation must occur prior to any form of political action through the individualized consumption of artworks in bourgeois cultural institutions, precisely because praxis as such will fail until this self-transformation has been carried out due to the totalizing power of capitalist ideology. In each paradigm, praxis is understood as largely utilitarian. There's little sense that the act of resistance itself can be creative or generative, or that it can transform the self in a manner that has emancipatory or prefigurative potential. From this perspective, we might say that socially engaged art practices over the past 3 decades represent a practical and speculative attempt to reconceptualize the nature of both political and aesthetic consciousness. For the artists and collectives producing this work, revolutionary consciousness, like revolution itself, is communicable and social. It emerges through the process of collective social action as the experience of resistance produces new modes of agency and new capacities to envision an alternative future. In this manner, criticality is produced through an answerable relationship to an actual site of resistance, entailing specific institutional forces and counterforces and concrete interlocutors that can act back on the work in real time. As a result, the production of criticality in these projects must constantly be re-articulated and modified in response to these ongoing exchanges. The work evolves then through a series of iterations, each building on the experience accrued from the one that came before. This accounts for the intrinsic plasticity of engaged art practices as they move away from the physical stasis of an object-based aesthetic paradigm. It also accounts for the scalar complexity of engaged art projects, which seek to socialize the transformation of consciousness that is central to the aesthetic, rather than holding this transformative potential in suspension in the mind of the individual viewer or artist. As a result, socially engaged art practices operate along an expanded continuum that reflects the interdependence between individual consciousness and social or collective action. Here I'll outline this continuum with a series of brief examples. On one end of the continuum are projects that are restricted, at least initially, to a small number of participants. This is exemplified by Saba Zavari's Radio Huban project in Iran, which began in 2018. Zavari left Iran in 2010 to live in London following violent government reprisals against the Green Movement protests in which she was involved. She developed a Radio Huban project, and that's a word that means street in Farsi, to explore the ways in which gender is policed in public space in Iran. In particular, the project took aim at a regulation that forbids women from singing in public. And you might be familiar with the genre of situational dance performance in Iran as well by women that has evolved in the last 5 years along similar lines. In particular, the project, oh, I already said that. The seed for this project was planted in 2014 when Zavari was visiting the famous Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque in Isfahan, which was familiar to her. I have a picture of it. It's a beautiful mosque, familiar to her from her childhood. While there, she recorded herself surreptitiously singing a love song to Iran. The architectural space of the mosque provided an ideal acoustic environment for this improvisational performance. The resulting video was widely viewed and inspired her to expand the project to document other women engaging in the same act. What would, in another context, be the most routine occurrence became, in the context of Iran's repressive policing of women's bodies, a simple but beautiful act of transgression. Zavari describes the next steps in the process in a 2021 interview, which I'll put up here. Just a quote from the interview. The result was an ongoing series of recordings which document these transgressive public performances by other women, throughout Iran via a podcast and a website, along with interviews in which each singer reflects on her experience of singing in public space. Zavari chose the concept of radio, an oral form that is associated with the public broadcast of information, to represent the aspirations of the project, as it documents hundreds of individual acts of, resistance on the streets of Iranian cities. Thus, the street that is alluded to in the project's title is as yet only prefigurative. The project thus seeks to explore how, as she writes, silenced and constrained women must creatively navigate the same streets that men easily move through. The actual ability of women to express themselves freely in public has yet to be achieved, but in these countless acts of micro-resistance, we can recognize the forms of critical consciousness and creative expression necessary to eventually win this freedom. At the next level, we encounter projects, we encounter projects which encompass larger collective interactions and concrete transformations, in specific institutional systems. The TAMS Year 10 project, developed through a collaboration between Laurie Jo Reynolds, current and former incarcerated persons and their families, was launched in 2007. Reynolds had begun working at the TAMS Correctional Center, it's a prison, that's a fancy word for a prison, in Southern Illinois as part of a Poetry in the Prisons program. But she quickly discovered that poetry was relatively meaningless for inmates who were struggling to survive the dehumanizing conditions of a supermax prison that consigned its entire population to permanent solitary confinement. Reynolds was led by this experience to reframe her involvement in the prison and her understanding of her own artistic practice. Working with inmates and their families, she developed a platform-based initiative called the TAMS Year 10 Project, which combined a grassroots legislative campaign, lobbying, tactical media interventions, performative demonstrations and public actions, which I'll just show you some pictures of, and cultural projects with prisoners, which included a series called photo requests from solitary, where prisoners would request somebody on the outside to make a picture they could put in their cell. I'll just show you some examples here. Its goal was to generate the support necessary to close the TAMS facility within a decade. She describes the complex process of achieving this goal as a form of what she calls legislative art. Right, reminds me a little bit of Augusto Boal's legislative theater. And it led to the actual closure of TAMS in 2013. In this process, Reynolds and her collaborators became adept at deciphering the complex flow of authority and decision-making, both within the prison bureaucracy and at the legislative level. Their task was to reconstruct a kind of archaeology of this power structure in order to discern its hidden points of access and intervention. This involved, in turn, a precise attunement to key moments of performative potential in the otherwise routine interactions that they had with prison officials, wardens, and legislators, in which subtle shifts in body language, affect, or expression might signal an opening up of their awareness regarding the condition of the inmates. Reynolds and her collaborators learned how to use these moments, for example, the warden agreeing to conjugal visits for the first time, to provide the foundation for more ambitious reforms by linking them with subsequent organizational work. It was Reynolds' identity as an artist that allowed her to experience a degree of trust and receptivity among prison officials that would not have been possible for someone aligned with an NGO or conventional activist group. This same movement toward larger social configurations and more direct engagement with existing institutional systems is evident as well in the work of Gezi Park fiction, which I won't go into detail about. I just wanted to mention as a parallel. This is a ceremony that occurred when they actually closed TAMS prison in 2013 as a result of this project. Anyway, I won't go into detail about Park fiction so much, but it's wanted to present it as a parallel in terms of the scale that they're operating at, and in terms of transforming a particular, a larger structural system, in this case at the municipal level. The project resulted in a permanent transformation of the built environment. I think I got some pictures in here. The barricade days and the Hafenstrasse, 1986-87, right? That's the groundwork that allows for Park fiction to succeed later. Always violence lurking in the background, in that case, allowing for the change to occur later. The project resulted in a permanent transformation of the built environment. In this case, the creation of a new public park in a location that was initially intended for upper income housing. It's important to note that it succeeded in part because the Hafenstrasse has a long history of militant resistance dating back to the 1980s. And that's, of course, the park today. I won't belabor that. At the third level, we encounter projects in which the correlation between artistic production and broader forms of political activism is not simply prefigurative or mnemonic in the case of Gezi Park fiction, because they changed the name to Gezi Park fiction a little bit later, in conjunction with protests taking place in Turkey, but is actualized in real time. This approach occurs in the Escraches of Eos and Grupo Etc., which I won't go into great detail about, but you might be familiar with. The Escraches were a series of actions that took place in Argentina after there was a series of these laws passed in 86, 87 that basically excused a lot of the governmental and military officials associated with the Proceso period and the disappearance and murder of thousands of Argentinians. And so this impunity, kind of this sense that the crime of that period of time was being papered over through a kind of an imposed social amnesia, led to collaborations that involved Grupo de Arte Callejero and the Grupo Etc. And again, this is work that's been written about a good bit. You might be familiar with it, but it involved identifying the homes of former members of the junta and then staging a whole series of actions around the home, billboards and street signs that would announce the presence of someone that they were claiming was involved in genocide. And then these kind of Dadaistic performances that took place. This is some of the mapping of some of the homes. And then demonstrations that would arrive in front of the home, and then street work. Is a whole ensemble of elements. There's the pre-escrache, which was months of work ahead of time before the demonstration, of learning about that particular neighborhood and the history of the neighborhood and how aware people were of the violence of the past. There's a whole complex set of elements involved that lead up to what the element that people are most familiar with, which are these kind of remarkable performances in front of the houses where they try to mark the home with red paint, blood-like paint. But the example I wanted to mention in a little more detail, that's just another parallel in terms of the scale, was the Lava La Bandera action in Peru in 2000, that's washing the flag. That was staged by the CSC. It's a Colectivo Sociedad Civil, or Civil Society Collective, in 2000. The CSC was composed of artists and activists who came together in opposition to the dictatorial behavior of then President Alberto Fujimori, who was in power as the result of a coup in 1992. The performances were initially staged, that's one of them, in the Plaza Mayor, directly in front of the presidential palace in Lima, and entailed the simple act of washing the Peruvian flag in a large fountain at this plaza center. This gesture was directed at the perceived corruption of the Fujimori regime, which was engaging in widespread election fraud. The act of washing the flag was soon replicated in towns and villages throughout the country, providing a powerful visual expression of the breadth of public revulsion at Fujimori's leadership. The government, sensing the threat posed by this performance as a locus of popular discontent, attempted to block the flag washing through police interventions and efforts to incite violence among the protesters. At every step, the protesters had to revise and modify their own actions in response to the government's provocations. And that's a little quote from Bootax, Gustavo Bootax, an artist that was a key figure in the CSC. Where I think I've got a quote here as well. There it is. I'll jump ahead to that. That's just documentation, the flag washing at various points. That's a quote. I'm not going to read it. I just put it in there if you're interested to get a little flavor of how the kind of pas de deux between the authorities and the protesters played out. Where TAMS Year 10 and Gezi Park Fiction sought to win concessions from an existing municipal or state level power structure, CSC was part of a broader national protest and intended to overthrow the country's political leadership. The Lava La Bandera performances began in May 2000, and by mid-November, Fujimori had fled the country. Of course, the flag washing was simply one part of a broader mosaic of oppositional gestures that led to his downfall. However, the performances did play a crucial role in sustaining public opposition and solidarity, as Bootax argues. With the political parties on the retreat and many politicians on the defensive, Lava La Bandera coalesced the citizenry's sheer will to not yield, to not surrender. So it's a symbolic locus. Each of these projects define themselves through a process of critical differentiation, a mode of alterity that is generated through the act of resistance itself. In some cases, this differentiation is produced by the intervention of an external agent into a relatively static system of domination. In the Radio Huban project, Zavary enjoyed the mobility and freedom necessary to facilitate and document the covert performances of Iranian women, and generated the initial gesture of dissent through her own experience of displacement from Tehran to London. In other cases, we encounter a social system undergoing a process of repressive disequilibrium in which the social agents already present at the site still enjoyed sufficient freedom to challenge the process. This is evident in the Lava La Bandera actions as Peru was sliding into an increasingly autocratic form of rule. As we review the three spatial registers outlined above, we can identify a symptomatic continuity, moving from the transformation of individual consciousness, evident at the most privatized level in the Radio Huban performances, to the expansion of this process to encompass a larger social body in the work of TAMS, the TAMS project, and finally to collective resistance directed at repressive political regimes. Bootax has this, whoops, oh my goodness, didn't mean to do that. Here we go. I think I got it. I don't know why it keeps doing that. You don't want to see that. You want to see, oh, sorry about that. My computer's acting up. Oh my goodness, it doesn't want me to go any further. Hang on 1 second. Okay, that's not in there. That's all right. I'll leave this one up. Okay, Bootax has captures this relationship in his analysis of the Lava La Bandera. He says there's a cultural overthrow of dictatorship. Oh, I had that one earlier. As important and decisive as its economic, political, or military overthrow. For what is thus obtained is an alteration of public consciousness that is also an awakening of the most intimate individual consciousness and a lasting turn in the prevailing common sense of the times. And I think that really clarifies that linkage between individual consciousness transformations, social or broader transformations of consciousness. Taken in the aggregate, these projects demonstrate the potential congruence between the creative transformation of individual consciousness, which is typically the primary locus of critical meaning in conventional artistic practice, public consciousness, and collective political action. Of course, the specific forms of action that are possible at any given moment will vary greatly, depending on the particular modes of social or political domination against which they contend. Thus, a project like the Escraches, which entailed open confrontation with former members of the Argentine junta, would be inconceivable in the context of contemporary Iran. What is essential in each case is understanding the complex calibration of resistance in a manner that preserves the essential tension between the tactical and the prefigurative, and between the reality of existing political constraints and the capacity to transcend those constraints both imaginatively and practically. I've described this work above as marking the transition from an object or image-based aesthetic to an event-based aesthetic paradigm, but that does not mean that images and objects do not play a key role. The artwork as event does entail an engagement with representational materials that provide a frame within which the participants' critical distance from normative values can be given semantic form. However, these mediated materials are placed in an answerable relationship to actual modes of repression. We might describe this as constituting a form of non-monological semblance, as the image or object is no longer confined to the reflective consciousness of the individual viewer, but rather is mobilized within and among a network of social actors engaged with a set of active political processes. Thus, these projects are constituted around a symbolic armature that faces both inwards, where it is linked with the recognition of a semantic and normative contingency among the participants, and outwards to an audience consisting of representatives of the state. Rather than a paradigm of aesthetic production divided between a realm of autonomous critical reflection on the one hand and a realm of utilitarian political action on the other, an event-based aesthetic combines moments of mediated reflexive critique with moments of tactical action. Or rather, these are understood as two complementary phases within a larger artistic process, effectively condensing the temporal delay between self-reflexive insight here and now and some future moment of political practice. As a result, critical distance is secured in these projects through forms of displaced symbolic production oriented towards the broader social world. Excuse me, this is evident in the Dadaistic performances of the Escraches, the flag-washing gesture of the Lava La Bandera actions, and the mobilization of a parodic urban planning process in Gezi Park fiction. For these gestures to be situationally meaningful, they must also be legible to the participants at the level of content or symbolic referent. This doesn't mean, however, that their significance is reductive or fixed. In fact, the scenography of the Escraches, the flag washing, the covert public singing of Radio Huban is extremely complex. What is occurring here is not a simple reduction of artistic meaning to the crude equivalence of propagandistic representation. Rather, what we observe is a process by which those forms of meaning that were seen as natural or given embodied in symbolic materials or concepts like the flag or justice or public space, are revealed to be contingent and available to be taken over and infused with new meaning. This realization is the foundation of any practice of resistance, the recognition that change is possible and that those institutional and discursive systems which seem permanently fixed are in fact open to transformation. This semantic indeterminacy extends to the very social space within which these projects unfold. Thus, the publicness of these gestures is often tentative, partial, or incomplete. The singing performances of Radio Huban attempt to actualize a sphere of autonomous public expression and even dissent that doesn't fully exist yet in Iran. And the Escraches of Argentina attempt to reinvent justice in the degraded civil society of a post-junta Argentina in which the state has abandoned its role as an independent adjudicator of the public good. The public in this case is not a static entity, but rather a prefigurative capacity, a space of potential that can at the same time be performed in proximity to the mechanisms of social change necessary to bring it into practical existence. To the participants, these projects serve as enunciations that express volition, agency, and desire, and they are alive as enunciations rather than edicts, as expressions that change or shift over time, interlocutor, or situational context. For the police and the representatives of the state, they're experienced with a degree of uncertainty and indecision. Their meaning is provocative. They seem to point an accusatory finger at dominant power, but at the same time, this antagonistic gesture is often indirect or even poetic. The Escraches are histrionic and at times comical, even as they are fueled by profound levels of indignation. The flag washing is a domestic and inwardly directed action. One washes with one's head down, immersed in an action that is set apart from the surrounding context. The participants were engaged with the flag with an indirect symbol of power, even as the presidential palace was only 50 yards away. And yet this simple act was imbued with subversive criticality, as the average Peruvian claimed a transcendent position above the state from which to judge and condemn its conduct. The seriality of this gesture is an essential feature. One person washing a flag in the Plaza Mayor is idiosyncratic. A handful of people can be discreetly arrested, but hundreds of people and then thousands across the country is a threat that requires a level of overt repression that calls into question the very legitimacy of the regime that marshals it. Here again, we witness the symptomatic linkage between individual consciousness and social or collective action. In the presence of these often ambiguous and even oddly passive gestures, why not burn Fujimori in effigy or throw rocks through the windows of the torturers' homes in Argentina? The state is forced to engage in a complex political calculation. Is this gesture threatening? Is it likely to escalate or lead to other more aggressive actions? Can it be co-opted? What level of counter-response, what level of violence will the broader public tolerate in reacting to this gesture? This suggests the key role played by displacement or discontinuity in the symbolic economy of these projects. Each of these gestures forgoes a direct assault on authority, extended physical occupation of public space, destruction of property, staged conflicts with the police, which can easily enough be used to justify a retributive violence. Instead, they take up a symbolic or mediated relationship to dominant power, presenting what are often apparently trivial or purely symbolic gestures of protest, the innocuous act of washing the flag, for example. Since they are not aggressively challenging the entrenched authority of the state in a situation in which there's a profound asymmetry of power, these anomalous actions often result in a tactical delay in the state's response, which only gradually increases in severity due to the fear of appearing too authoritarian. The delay or disorientation of the state's response is decisive because it produces a quasi-autonomous space in which new forms of social and political agency can be both created, then verified in practice, and proliferate more widely. This tactical autonomy is paralleled by a cognitive autonomy in which the very experience of resistance produces among the participants a sense of their own distance from normative social or political values. This is evident in the imaginative and cognitive autonomy claimed by the individual Iranian women in Radio Huban, and in the self-expression of their desires in a profoundly constrained environment. We can observe it in the autonomy of the individual prisoners and family members, activists and artists associated with the TAMS Year 10 project. And finally, we can identify the autonomy of the Peruvian citizens who sought to reclaim the power to define the meaning of their flag and of Peruvian political subjectivity for themselves. We encounter here some of the ways in which aesthetic autonomy is recoded and rearticulated in socially engaged art practice. Certainly in these projects, there are moments of discontinuity and distantiation, the ability to stand outside of an existing system of political domination and survey it critically. But this autonomy can't be understood through a paradigm of absolute transcendence that is entirely independent from external material reality. Autonomy, or the capacity for autonomous critical thought, is not something that is simply possessed like a mental faculty by certain preternaturally gifted individuals. It is better understood as a contingent effect produced within a given field of social relationships and institutional tensions in conjunction with specific forms of practice. While it is possible to accumulate a body of theoretical knowledge based on the insights gained through individual practices, each context, each situation also imposes new challenges and opportunities and calls forth new responses. We can identify three discrete but contiguous forms of insight generated by socially engaged art practice. In each case, these insights are derived from the new modes of agency and speculative understanding that are opened up by a practical engagement with specific articulations of dominant power. Here, power is understood to operate on three levels. First, power is manifested in concrete effects at a local level. The deployment of police in Lima's main plaza, the surveillance of Tehran's streets by the morality police. Second, this physical expression of power is conditioned by a series of affiliated discursive systems that are specific to a given location, such as the symbolic and spatial vocabulary of the Plaza Mayor or the bureaucratic rituals of the prison industrial complex in Illinois. And finally, these localized ideological systems are structured in turn by a broader set of political and economic protocols, neoliberal capitalism, the civil structure of a military regime, and so on. Drawing on the conventions of music theory, we might describe the forms of knowledge generated by socially engaged art practices in these contexts as praxial, entailing both performance-based learning and new mental and cognitive orientations that emerge in response to the situational matrix of the performance. The first form of praxial insight involves tactical knowledge, which emerges as participants observe the effects produced on an existing apparatus of power by particular symbolic gestures and physical interventions, washing of the flag, the escraches, and so on. These may include changes in public policy, the blockage of certain economic logics, temporary or more lasting shifts in the distribution of power, or transformations in specific ideological fields. This knowledge is highly situational, includes the capacity to adapt and modify a given ensemble of actions as they elicit a counter response from the particular governmental or bureaucratic structure they're targeting. It should also be noted that this form of knowledge is both creative and pragmatic, and carries along with it the capacity to transform the consciousness of their participants or collaborators, as the initial success of a specific set of gestures can produce an enhanced sense of agency and a greater willingness to project the practice into new contexts in the future. The second form of insight is associated with new modes of critique directed at a given system of domination. Here, critique is linked to the principle of negation as a process which seeks to destabilize normative perceptions of specific political or economic systems. In the case of the Escraches, this involved a conscious effort to delegitimize a culture in which the perpetrators of past violence were simply absorbed unquestioningly back into the fabric of Argentine civil society. Here, as in the avant-garde tradition, the artist adopts a position external to the surrounding hegemonic culture. But in socially engaged practice, the artist does not claim this exteriority as a singular and unique capacity, nor do they assume that their critical awareness can only be preserved by abjuring any practical resistance to the culture it critiques. Rather, the forms of critical consciousness mobilized by engaged art practices are produced out of a process of a collective exchange. At the same time, critique is drawn along with action rather than isolated from it, which has the effect of providing critical intelligence with a far more nuanced understanding of the material nature of domination itself. The third form of knowledge production entails a prefigurative awareness associated with the modes of consensual decision-making and speculative creativity that unfold in a specific project. These require highly complex negotiations across the differing epistemological orientations, forms of identity, and political belief systems held by individual participants. We might describe the process of reflectively working through these intersubjective tensions as a kind of social labor that partially suspends normative modes of being driven by autonomous self-interest. At their optimal level, these interactions elicit a form of intersubjective experience that resonates quite clearly with the ethos of the aesthetic. In particular, they evoke the key moment, long deferred, when a given socius is able to generate its own norms and values rather than having them imposed by an external and arbitrary authority. For Adorno and many others in the long history of the avant-garde, this is the dreaded moment of premature desublimation, as we naively try to call an aesthetic sensus communis into practical existence. But the goal of these interactions is not to effect some final utopic reconciliation of self and other or subject and object. Rather, these projects seek to preserve the fundamental irreconcilability of these two terms, while at the same time facilitating forms of action that are both visionary and pragmatic. Here, the tensions and discontinuities that exist between self and other are not dissolved, but openly thematized as part of the very material of artistic practice itself. Rather than two fixed selves, each seeking to defend its a priori autonomy, a space is opened here for a concept of the self that no longer conforms to the ethos of bourgeois sovereignty. It is a space that is defined by modes of self-transformation that are reciprocal rather than unilateral. The goal is not a finished or finalized version of the self, like Schiller's idealized aesthetic subject or the communist new man, which will render all subsequent forms of intersubjective negotiation unnecessary. The goal is precisely to understand more deeply and more thoroughly the process by which the self is transformed and made more open, with the understanding that this process will never be fully complete. This is a process that no longer depends on a fixed notion of identity, which can only view external determination as marking the expansion of oneself at the expense of another. Instead, socially engaged art practices call into question the very concepts of externality and interiority on which the schema of conventional aesthetic autonomy is based. What these projects embody then is an ongoing experimentation with the parameters of identity itself. They ask if it's possible to produce a social space that exists apart from both the repressive universality of the community, party, or state on the one hand, and the sovereignty of the monadic self, epitomized by conventional artistic identity as much as bourgeois subjectivity on the other, through a series of experiential encounters that are both practical and reflective. So I'll leave it at that because we're about out of time. So thank you so much. And I guess we can turn it over to questions at this point. And I wonder if I should get out of screen share so people don't have to look at the same quote. I meant to do that earlier.
Thank you so much, Grant, for this very dense and rich talk.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, this was really great. And I see that there are a lot of people there and interesting, who might be interesting contributors and have some questions. But if I shall go first, maybe you'll need a minute. Yeah, then maybe what I find really intriguing is your term of the tactical autonomy. And I asked myself if, as you described it, if socially engaged art always is related to oppression in some way. Because the examples that you gave were always related to a certain power relation where there was, oppression at stake. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure, that's fine. You know, that's a complicated question to answer. I think that that tends to be the case. There's a continuum of practices. You know, I'm thinking of projects that are developed without this dialectical relationship to direct action and resistance that can be quite valuable. I'm not talking about them here, but that's a genre within contemporary art of projects that explore the formation of the social through these staged micro interactions between individuals and so on. That work can be really interesting, and it has a kind of a epistemological quality that has to do with exploring how we negotiate the relationship between self and other, which is a fundamentally aesthetic question, of course. And that in turn can be a kind of insight that can be transmitted to other contexts, such as contexts like struggles against oppression. So it's not to invalidate that kind of work. And maybe one could argue in a way, of course, this is the problem with terms like socially engaged art. Every form of art is engaged with the social one way or the other, you know, so just different ways to understand that connection. For me, what I find, and so this isn't an ontological thing, it's more just what I find compelling as a writer and to think about this work. I tend to find the points of mediation that occur in practices that are staged in relationship to these complex institutional and ideological forms of repression, that the creativity that's generated in that particular dynamic, especially valuable. Myself, and that's just the direction I've taken, but it's not to say that there aren't other forms of self-reflexivity that are also valuable. But I guess I want to say that the tendency has been to not value those forms, to believe that it's fact critical self-reflexivity cannot occur in these contexts, that they are not creative and generative. And so part of what I'm trying to do is make a counter argument that says, in fact, if you look closely at the practices, there is an argument to be made that it does occur, and it does have correlations with the aesthetic in ways that I find compelling. So that's like a kind of an answer.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
To all the others.
Can I ask
Yes,
a question?
Of course.
Yeah. I was interested in the amount of time that you gave to the flag washing action, and it's a very intriguing and compelling piece. But I was looking at it in a way that was perhaps more systematic than you did. I mean, what's intriguing about the work is that the action, through its diffusion, through it being taken over by those who are involved, is transformed into something that is very different from its point of origin. You know, it no longer possesses a singular authorship, obviously, but it also becomes something that's collectively involving in all kinds of ways. And I was wondering whether you could comment on that in more detail. Sure.
Yeah, well, that's another kind of complicated response that I don't want to use up too much of our time with. Yeah. So there is a movement, and it doesn't always happen, you know, John, this movement where things become, they proliferate, excuse me, virally, but it often is. The Escraches are a bit like that. The Escraches began at a smaller scale. And the evolution of the Escraches happened because EOS, which is the Sons and Daughters Against Forgetting in Argentina, which are the children of the disappeared generation, were doing all this research, and they couldn't figure out how to, you know, how to intervene. And so that drew in Grupo Etc. and GAC and others. And so then those also, in fact, the Escrache now, they're still practiced in Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America, having nothing to do with Grupo Etc. and GAC. They've morphed. Grupo Etc. changed their name. They're a whole other group now. So I think in both cases, in a lot of these cases, you have this creation of a module or an armature that then becomes available and is taken up. And I find that what I can say is I simply find that very interesting in terms of how we move from localized consciousness and localized gesture, and what is it that allows for that serial replication? What is it about that original gesture that allows it to be taken up and that recruits people to do so? And I don't have an answer. I agree. I find that a really compelling part of it. There's a deeper question about authorship as well there, but I'll just say that yes, I think that's super important, and it's one of the things that's interested me for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there no hands up, or is it only me who can't see them? Seems that there are no hands up. I had another question. What was it again?
There's no bad questions.
Yes, it was the question about your examples.
Yeah.
So what status do your examples have? Are they, did you kind of aim for a kind of typology where you would maybe also give other examples which are similar, or are these just random examples?
You know, I guess it's a little bit of both. I mean, those that are here that do art history, I mean, you kind of stumble into these things and you meet people and you learn about stuff. It's kind of it can't be super systematic. And the other challenge is, of course, this area of practice has expanded so dramatically in the last 20 years. I mean, I see this at Field all the time. It's like, oh my God, I had no idea there was this huge body of work going on in this place. And it's often not plugged into the circuits of the institutional art world in such a way that you learn about it as quickly. So to some extent, yeah, it's like I just learn about things and I get a sense that, well, that's that project I find compelling. I often don't know why I find it compelling until I sit down and think about it a while. And then I realize, oh, it's because it responds to this issue. So I don't want to say I'm super systematic. It's somewhat random. At the same time, as I was writing this book, I became conscious of a kind of a conceptual architecture that had to do with becoming as, in a way, Catholic as possible. I mean, like universal, not Catholic like the religion, but you know what I mean, like broadly thinking to how is there a way to understand this quite broad range of things, from like, we're going to overthrow a dictatorship to here's some people singing by themselves and recording it on their cell phones. And so I was trying to capture that capillary nature of those gestures that move between the individual to the social and collective and so on. So part of the decision was driven by looking for models that I could kind of identify. I was trying to be a little taxonomic in that sense. And elsewhere in the book, I do this more so. But yeah, I was after that scalar relationship and said these are interconnected gestures that exist on a broader continuum that we can look at kind of historically and critically, and that there's a way to understand them as affiliated gestures, even though they can seem like quite different.
Thank you. Now that's a question from Julian Woolen.
Hi, I'm actually Chloe. I'm just on someone else's.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask about, I mean, basically the general question is what is art? But for example, the example that you gave of the artwork where someone was in the prison and then was doing kind of things with poetry and realized that that was kind of irrelevant for the prisoners, and then started this action with the photographs. And then I wonder whether it could be argued, or whether you have had this question before, is that actually maybe in this example, the art became redundant and therefore it was political action that was needed. And so, yeah, I just wondered how you respond, when you are asked the question, which I'm sure you have been asked before, what is the difference between lots of this type of art and political action, and what makes it art?
So that's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer briefly, but I can think of a number of different ways to approach it. Let me say this: there is a liminal nature to this practice, because we're so accustomed to thinking about art as something that has to be, to some extent, firewalled off from the rest of the world. You know, in one way, they're institutionally, spatially, whatever. In fact, I have a class I was teaching on Tuesday, and we were talking about perambulation, or movement through space, as a practice. And I was showing them Richard Long, because he did all these walks in the 60s and the 70s. And then we talked about Gandhi's Salt March and the March on Selma. And I was trying to get at embodied experience and what are the politics of the body moving through space. And so you can certainly say, well, you know, that's art, that's not art. And for sure, I think by many definitions, a lot of the things I've written about wouldn't qualify as art in a more traditional setting. And that's okay. You know, there's a big institutional art world, and there's no danger that kind of art world art is going to cease to exist or anything. But it does kind of, it can be a little disturbing, because you're like, and then you're like, is my job to kind of police when they made because it's usually artists making the work. Like I don't think I've ever written about anything that wasn't made by artists who are saying it was art. So part of me kind of tends to take the artist at their word, in a sense, and to say, okay, I'll go on this journey with you. You know, Laurie Jo Reynolds, this happened a ton of times with me. And I'm like, let me go with you. And so you're the artist. I'm going to follow you and see where you're going. And you're telling me this is part of your practice. How can I learn? How do I have to revise my understanding of the limits of art in order to appreciate what you're doing? Now, that will require reinventing what I understand art to be, which is kind of a big project. The other thing I can say to that, and again, just briefly, I think there was a shift that happens really. Part of this has to do, this will seem really crude and schematic, but you see a kind of a broad global shift especially following the 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the USSR. Broad shift in the discourse of what political change looks like, going back to the Zapatistas and a lot of other examples. And you see a kind of emergent notion of political change that is different from the one that we're comfortable with historically in the 20th century, which is very much vanguard politics, and you overthrow the state and all the rest. And you can agree or disagree with the politics of that shift, but it really starts in the 1960s with new social movements. And so what happens there, I think, is that how we understand political change occurring shifts and becomes contiguous with shifts in artistic practice. There's a kind of a convergence that occurs around performativity, around moving away from hierarchical structures of command and control in the vanguard party. I mean, C.L.R. James was complaining about the vanguard party in the 1950s, for crying out loud. So there's a coming together of those two practices in ways that gets kind of messy and hard to disentangle sometimes. And so there may not be a way to absolutely provide a clear, you know what I mean? Like, and for me, I've kind of decided that's okay. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I could kill myself trying to come up with a fixed ontology that would say this becomes art at this point, and it stopped being, when Laurie Jo Reynolds stopped doing poetry, it stopped being art, and da da da. But I'm more interested in learning about the practice in a way, in that sense, and less interested in, because as critics, we get very comfortable policing things. So that's not much of an answer, but those are some of the thoughts that come into my head when I think about that.
No, I think that's a good answer. I think especially because I think a lot of people sometimes criticize this type of artwork for the fact that it's, you know, like art can't escape the art market and the art world. But actually, even if there's situations in which these kind of social practices do somehow get absorbed into the art market, it doesn't, even if that does happen, it doesn't maybe detract from what it did in the first place.
Yeah, that's a seems like a sensible way to look at it.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
You're welcome.
Martin, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Grant, so much for the talk. I've been reading some of your writing in the past months, and one of the I actually had prepared a question that I figured was not a very good question. It was about Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen's note on socially engaged art criticism, and his sort of critique of your use and suggestion of ethnography and field research. And when I first read your response, I didn't find your response to this particular point, but it's in a footnote, so I can't ask about that. But I wanted to ask about the notion of, because you choose the notion of the field for the journal, and it's obviously problematic, and you discussed that, I think, also in the first editorial. So obviously, I'm just curious to hear you discuss a little bit, like, how do you see this concept function? And because I think there's a very, very obvious risk of understanding fields in a very ontological sense, as them existing the outer in some sense. And I mean, first of all, we must qualify the singular. We have a variety of fields. And so, yeah, what are the problematics of the term, and why do you think it's useful? And maybe just to add to that, one last question, the role of canonizing projects. Karen sort of addressed this briefly in the introduction, and you know, at some point, projects become canonized and belong to the sort of perhaps artificial field of socially engaged art, and maybe, you know, what are the pitfalls there would be my question. So
let me see. Let me know if I think I've got this right. So you're asking about the term field from, say, field journal, and wondering about maybe the extent to which that imposes a false uniformity on a body of work that's actually quite inchoate in some way and unbounded and so on. So that's part of it. And then canonization is maybe the other part of it. So yeah, those are great questions. I guess it's in terms of field and the danger of containing things. I think that's a you know, I think you might have mentioned, or Karen did. I talk about this issue in field, and you know, it's a trade-off. You know, you could, is it helpful to use the term field or to conceptualize it as a field, as opposed to just saying, I'm just going to write about some projects, and I'm not going to, but then what tools do I use to write about them? Oh, I'm going to use some tools from sociology, but I'm going to choose to not use tools from art history because I don't want to make people think it's art. Okay, but it's going to be sociology. Well, sociology has got its own problematic histories and so on. So then I'm going to have to become critically self-aware of the limitations of sociological discourse. And then, you know, like, you kind of get into this ramifying meta relationship, which is it's all true. You know what I mean? Like, yep, it's and so if I talk about it as art, is that going to contribute to the kind of enhanced symbolic capital that the work accrues? And then next thing you know, it's in the Venice Biennale and all. Yeah. They're kind of like occupational errors, like risks, I guess, that you run. I don't know I'm not sure how to engage with the work at a kind of a substantive level as a scholar or a writer and not run a little bit of that risk. So I don't have an easy answer to that, except to say that, you know, the trade-off for me would maybe be to not be able to write about the work necessarily, or to feel like there's too much of a risk. Now I'll say, here's a good example of this. Grupo de Arte Callejero, which is involved with the Escraches, or no, maybe it was etc. I can't remember which. They were approached after the Escraches happened. They were approached by a curator at the Venice Biennale. It was a GAC, Grupo de Arte Callejero, and they said, no, we're not interested in being having the work circulated in the institute. A lot of these groups have made that choice. When inevitably the curator comes a calling and says, oh, the new manifesta, blah, 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 they say, no, thanks. Because they've decided that for them, their audience, it doesn't mean if you do that, you're an evil person or anything. It just means it's a different institutional site, right? But they made a choice that their primary interlocutors are going to be the people at these sites in some way. Doesn't mean the work doesn't eventually maybe end up in the art world, but it's not being made with that kind of reception theory in mind, like it's made eventually imagining some curator looking at it, that kind of thing. Doesn't mean the curator can't do it, but as much as they can, they kind of make that choice. But of course, it's a mess. I mean, some artists do, some artists don't. So I don't really have a great answer to that because it's an obvious limitation of the research, and I'm not sure. I haven't figured out a way to work outside of that constraint by inevitably when you write about it, somebody's going to see that, and then it's kind of out of your control what they do in terms of the work and so on. So I don't know. It's a great question. I just if you have a solution, let me know.
No, thank you for a wonderful sort of draft to a response.
Of course.
Next will be Anita Wojtowicz.
Hi, I hope it's okay. I'm not on camera.
No worry about it. My students are like that all the time. I'll teach 200 people and it's all blank on my Zoom, right? No worries.
I'm sorry.
Fine.
I hope it's not too infant question, but usually when people protesting and using flags, it will be symbolic of catharsis, burning them. But I noticed when you was talking, it's about washing them. And I'm just wondering, is it because South America is very Catholic and Christian society? Is it something in common with baptism?
Baptism.
Yeah, baptism.
Yes.
Like, do you think it might be correlated with this?
That's a great point. You know, that symbolism of that project is much more complicated than I could get into, and that's an excellent point. Okay, so I think there could be a connection to at least to the sacral notion of washing or water.
Yeah.
In the Catholic religion. Also, the fountains in Latin America and Peru, certainly, almost every little town has a fountain in the main public square that people congregate around and will, I don't know if they still do, but in the olden days might do their wash in. And so it's mobilizing a kind of I don't want to say folk memory exactly, but a cultural memory of the fountain as a communal space and of washing and the sacral nature of washing a thing to cleanse it, not to destroy it. They want to,
exactly.
They don't want to burn it because they believe that they themselves have a truer knowledge of the meaning of that flag than the guy that's besmirching it with his corruption. So that's a great observation, Anita. Absolutely. And I didn't go into that, but it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one question in the chat before it's Teresa's turn. And the question here is posted by Ala Buizir. And the question is about the relationship between visual sociology and socially engaged art.
Well, you know, I know a little bit about visual sociology, but not a huge amount. It's like I have some recollection from graduate school of doing some research in visual sociology, but that was, that was in the 19th century. So I'm sure it's changed since then. Yes, as I recall, and maybe Ala, you can educate me about that. But as I recall, there's an interest in sociologists exploring the cultural politics of visual representation and visual performance and so on in society. And I would imagine that there's a lot of overlaps. I have not tended to draw on that research, not because I don't think it's probably valuable. I just have had my hands full with a lot of other sources in my current research, and it's probably something I should look into. It's tended, from the work that I'm familiar with, has tended to be focused on, even though it overlaps in really useful ways, like with the Lava La Bandera, it also tends to focus on sometimes, I don't want to overstate this, but I think sometimes sociologists can have a slightly less refined understanding of the nature of the image. And it can be a little programmatic sometimes, the material that I've read in terms of, well, the image equals this, and da, 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 you know what I mean, like that. But it's definitely something I should probably look into. If you have a particular point about it, I would love to hear or learn from you if there's something you want to share with me.
Okay, I think it's Teresa's turn now.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your writing. I want to say, just for a little context, that I've been writing my master's thesis on dialogical art and commemoration, and I'm based in Austria, so I am interested in applying these concepts of social sculpture, socially engaged arts, and dialogical aesthetics for creating moments of commemoration of the Nazi past, and how to reckon with this as children and grandchildren of the perpetrators, and also sometimes in coming together with children and grandchildren of victims of the Nazi regime. So I am also interested in this notion of, is socially engaged art always something that is fighting for rights for somebody, or can it also be like the social cause, be I want to find ways how to be able to relate to a very difficult history of a collective. And I'm interested in these different concepts that you are using in your writings: dialogical aesthetics, dialogical art, social sculpture, socially engaged arts. How do they interrelate with each other? How do they also come together and compose something, and sometimes more of this or more of that? And within all of that, how do you look at actually dialogue as in a more like literal sense of people talking to each other in a certain quality? And is this something that you look at? Because when in my own projects, in dialogue is very central. I studied linguistics, and maybe that's also where I'm coming from, that I differentiate a lot about on which level are we actually talking? Is it just like arguments that we are kind of like just throwing at each other, or are we like actually really finding a place of connection or of mutual understanding, or also to how to be with in this struggle of sitting in the uncomfort of relating to that history in very delicate settings when the descendants of victims and perpetrators are coming together. So I'm very interested in the refinement of this art, and what does it mean to be like a really refined dialogical artist, and what is the capacities I need to train as a listener and as a speaker, as somebody bringing in questions or opening a space for dialogue. Also being aware of transgenerational trauma and how it shows up in people and in conversations and encounters. So I know it's a huge thing, but I'm so happy that finally I have a moment to also connect with you after going through your writings, part of it.
Well, great. Nice to connect with you as well. Those are all really interesting thoughts, and there maybe isn't a question so much as just an expression of your interest. I would say, I think you were kind of asking this as well. For sure, I think there's a huge body of fascinating practice dealing with issues of historical trauma, memory, and so on. I mean, the escraches are basically that same thing in a sense. But there's lots of other examples going on. I mean, right now, this is slightly different, but at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, there's a series of these protests called Rhodes Must Fall, which was about a very provocative, the statue of Cecil Rhodes, the founder of apartheid-based South Africa, and protests and actions by the students to have the statue removed and so on. And then that also relates to, I don't know if you guys follow politics in the US, but there's a neo-fascist rally in Virginia, where there's Richmond, Virginia, where there's a large statue of Robert E. Lee on a horse. He was a general who led the Confederate Army in the Civil War. And a whole series of intervention stays around that. And these are all about memory, trauma, loss, clearly have fascinating cultural and political implications, and are often involving, in both cases, artists intervening in various ways. So for sure that work would, for me, I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, now I'm making a field again, but in what I think of as like, work that I find compelling, that would be definitely part of it. And in terms of dialogue, I mean, this is simultaneously incredible. All the way back to semiotics, like Saussure's, founding gesture is to bracket parole or the Speech Act, because he doesn't think it's susceptible to scientific analysis. He's only going to focus on the structure of language. The speech acts are seen as these merely epiphenomenal kind of derivative, uncreative gestures, and language produces all the meaning, which is a very Althusserian kind of paradigm. Or Victor Shklovsky, the Russian formalist literary theorist, prosaic forms of communication are always degraded, and work songs are superficial and so on. The only authentic form of a dialogue or exchange or what have you is a particular forms of poetry. So there's such a history of bifurcating how we understand dialogue or conversation or cultural expression as being creative. But there's a lot of artists. I was thinking of Martin Kren's work and a bunch of other folks that are exactly looking at this issue, not in terms of commemoration and memory per se, but in terms of how you mobilize, how complicated does dialogue become. I spend a good bit of time in one of these books I have just finished on Mikhail Bakhtin, who's been an important source for me over the years, because he's writing in a Marxist context, but he's also effectively living under Stalinism. So he has a very unique perspective from the left on creativity. And so there is a body of interesting research out there that you can draw on that will hopefully give you some useful insights to probe a little bit. How does a conversation become generative or transformative? There's also a thing called nonviolent communication, NVC. I don't know if you've come across that or not. Yeah, Marshall Rosenberg, people like that. So there's a whole body. This is, again, this good example of how art becomes kind of adjacent to other practices. But it's a fascinating body of work on how people use conversation to negotiate these complex points of tension between self and others. So
yeah, and I also think it's also very interesting to look at simply tools that artists in these fields use. Like as a painter uses the same pencil that somebody else is doing something else with. And maybe I'm using tools that a facilitator uses in a workshop settings, which is outside of art, but it's a good training for artists who are working with groups. Thank you so much for that answer.
Of course.
Thank you for sharing this. Zoni Deng has a question.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions actually. So first one is, can you talk a bit more about answerability? Do you mean by this kind of symbolic performative acts that is answerable by social actors on a symbolic aesthetic level? This is the first question. And the second one is about the prefigurative powers of these practices. Can this be beyond symbolic level? So Yes.
Okay, those are great questions. I really like your library. You have a lot of books. That's great. You have even more books than Karen has in your library.
This is just a virtual background.
Okay. Let's see. The first question was about answerability. So that's a term, I couldn't get into it here because of this time constraints, but that's a term from Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin. And there's some interesting relationship between Bakhtin and a guy named Alexander Bogdanov, who was a rival of Lenin's in the revolutionary period, that touches on these issues as well. But Bakhtin talks about answerability as a model. It's very, in some ways, I can give you the simple version of it, really. It's the idea that expression is that not just expression, but I suppose that the self is constructed, as he says, at the threshold between self and other. And so a lot of his, both his early neo-Kantian writing and then his later critical writing on literature, which was in part something he had to do because of their inability to write on politics more overtly. There's a kind of a Aesopian, we call it an Aesopian language in Bakhtin, where he has to approach these political issues tangentially. A lot of his writing is about how the self and the other relate to each other in a manner in which the constitution of the self is transformed. It's like George Herbert Mead has a similar argument, but Bakhtin's is in many ways more nuanced, that the self is constructed in the relationship to the other, but not in a way that requires either the self or the other to utterly abandon their autonomy, but that there's the kind of a stage negotiation that has utopian potentials. Because if we go back to the Enlightenment aesthetic, the whole nature of the sensus communis and say Kant, or the way Schiller takes it up, is very much that, hey, we're entering a period of desacralization. We have the potential to no longer be ruled by a coercive external force that's going to tell us what to do. Now, maybe for the first time in a European context, we have the freedom to generate our own norms. I mean, autonomy is autonomous. It means self-governing. I give norms to myself, right? But norms have to be social to be meaningful. Otherwise, it's just privatized rules. So there's built a moment that the aesthetic is dedicated to. The Enlightenment version of the aesthetic is those negotiations of difference between self and other that produce a utopian society. That's the sensus communis, Gemeinsen, aesthetic state, and Hegel, and so on. So yes, when I use answerability, you can find elements of this in the concept of social labor in Marx as well, but I'm looking for a vocabulary that will allow me to unpack the creativity of those relationships between self and other, because for me, that's the foundation, in some ways a necessary foundation for understanding the nature of the political. Because if you don't resolve that problem and you just leave that for after the revolution, then it tends to not work out so well historically. And that's where the prefigurative comes in. If you look at the way Lenin understood revolution, it was entirely instrumental in that sense, especially after 1919 or so. That's when the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat comes to fruition. He barely discusses it until 1920. Then he's discussing it a lot. He says, we should stop using the word commune, right? Because the Russian people are starting to ask, when do they actually get the freedom they fought and died for? And so there's always a deferral, a delay of the realization of that, the transformative potential of us, right? A given society, working together to develop new norms and so on. And so that is, for me, a key missing piece of a lot of political theory. So that's the answer. That's kind of a slightly convoluted answer to that question. What was the second question? Now it's gone out of my head. You asked about answerability.
The prefigurative powers of social engagement, can that go beyond the symbolic aesthetic level?
So it depends on what you mean by symbolic and aesthetic. Certainly, I would say that, I wouldn't say that yes, I would say that it's symbolic. For me, what's important about the prefigurative experiences that might get mobilized, and let's look at an example of that, like, the scratches I talked about. there's a group of artists and activists associated with the Escraches, and I can remember an interview with one of them, and he said, you know, everybody told us in Argentina that nothing could change. They passed the impunity laws in 86, 87. There's no hope of any change whatsoever. Why even try? And we've been really taught, you know, in some ways by certain forms of critical theory, that the appropriative powers of capitalism are so completely monolithic. You know, it's like Adorno talks about this, exaggeration. So when you read critical theory, it's always wanting to exaggerate the levels of hegemonic control. And the Argentinian artist said, you know, what was important to us was to try to do something at a time in which everybody said nothing was possible. So that's the prefigurative element. That's one manifestation of it. Or the Sabazavari singing performances. She does not live in a country yet where women can sing freely or even dance on streets without being eventually locked up or punished in various ways. But how do we get to the point that that kind of society can exist if people do not start to cultivate the ability to recognize what that new society that would come after it looks like? So for me, that's the prefigurative element, and it's super important, and it kind of gets left out of. This is why Lenin was so critical of Bogdanov, because Bogdanov's like, I'm going to form these workers' culture clubs, and they're going to, you know, the culture has to come from the workers. And he says, no, the workers are not capable of generating culture. He wants to close down the proletariat theaters. He says to Lunacharsky, put all the theaters in coffins, because there are all these amateur theater groups after the revolution. So put the theaters in coffins. We don't need the people acting and performing and having these kind of creative prefigurative encounters and so on. So my view is that it's essential that a prefigurative, that is a speculative engagement with what life would look like after change, is integrated with change itself. That's just my own, you know, there's a very clear counter argument, how naive you are, et cetera, et cetera. For sure, I respect that, but that's just my feeling. So sorry, that's kind of a long, convoluted answer, but it's slightly a complicated question. So I hope some of that was helpful.
Thank you.
I feel today is the day of complicated questions. And yeah, we are a little bit running out of time, but we have one last question, maybe a short one and short answer, because I really would appreciate to announce Mark James Leger's next talk in April before everyone leaves. So Alexei.
Yes, I'm sorry, I will try not to be too long, and thanks for your talk and for both kind of theoretical aspects and this exciting material you brought into your talk. I wouldn't ask this question probably if I wouldn't be somehow triggered by your last part of this conversation, these references to Bakhtin, this Soviet post-revolutionary context, and also about prolet cult, which would be interesting actually to interpret in a way of you are doing this sort of dialogical aesthetics, which I never thought about this because my partner, she's also an academic, she's doing research on prolet cult. It could be an interesting idea actually. But I thought that in reality, prolet cult was much more militant and much more exclusive, and the dialogue interpreted in this sort of soft kind of way would not be be this sort of way they are proceeding. And in general, Bakhtin, I think as well, where you could read him against Stalinism, against this sort of contestation of this kind of supreme authority of the leader, etc., etc. But in a way, I think in general, Bakhtin was very concerned about this sort of dialogue, rather an ideal discoursive situation when parties meet for deliberation of Bakhtin. But from my reading Bakhtin in the past, more about this dialogue as more than a sort of productive mechanism, not as the sort of space of the deliberation, etc. So, which brings me also to somehow your notes to relate avant-garde and Stalinism. We know that kind of Stalinism is a kind of sublimated avant-garde or whatever. But still, I think it's interesting to what imposing itself instead of being in dialogue, or etc., etc. still, could it be related to further more mature debates about avant-garde, not just Adorno, but also, for example, I'm curious about this stuff because I'm teaching this stuff as well, like Peter Burger discussion of the institutional kind of aspects of avant-garde. So it's not testing the sovereignty of individual artists, but rather this sort of institution which is created within capitalism and produced not just because of fantasies of autonomy in somebody's head, but somehow produced in the objective conjuncture of modernity. So in this further debate, like how foster neo-avant-garde, just curious, but if I understand it's very long and you're free not to reflect on any of on all these points, but just trigger a very short answer from you, not long. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. And those are, you know, it would be a great conversation to have with you over several drinks. It sounds like there's so much to get into.
Yeah.
For sure.
The only thing we are missing through this electronic communication.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, it's funny because Boris Groys has this essay where he basically says Bakhtin's a closet Stalinist.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there's such we don't have time to get into it, but there's a very vexed debate in Bakhtinian studies about some of these issues, his authoritarianism or his messianic kind of theological orientation and so on and so forth. But that's we can't get into that now. Let me say one thing about the prolocult that might be interesting, because of course there's many prolocults. I mean, it was, you know, yeah. It was a huge movement. But the place that I was looking to find the more whatever utopian version of it, especially because later it gets, you know, it's taken out of Lunacharsky's control and placed under more direct party control. But early on, there's a whole body of this amateur theater work that is just, I've only recently come aware of it because of recent translations into English. There's just an anthology came out a few years ago by a guy named Stefan Aquilina. And some of the writing there is fascinating. It is much more in this less militant, more, you know, workers producing plays and theater on their own. It's a little bit like Irvin Piscator in Germany did a lot of this in a kind of workers developing their own theater projects and so on stuff. So that got me interested because I was like, okay, there's a collective or collaborative there. The people play different roles in the theater production and so on. So I found it interesting as a kind of a touchstone to say, okay, there's these periodic moments at which some of these conventions get broken down a little bit. And then, you know, yeah, there's a whole discussion to be had about the Berger and the neo-avant-garde, which again would be, it'd be hard to do. But there's a quote from Hal Foster when he talks about, there's an interview he does about the neo-avant-garde, and he says something like this. He says, oh, the reason everybody in October liked, you know, what we were about in the 80s and so on, I think I probably get this wrong, but he says, we were, when they're attacking neo-expressionism, he says, we were pledged against any kind of affirmative notion of art. And that was very striking to me. So affirmative means art that communicates any kind of a message that can be seen as positive or traffics in any kind of feel good. It's like Trotsky when he talks about revolutionary art. It says revolutionary art can only be based on what he calls a principle of social hatred. And then after the revolution, he says all the emotions that we revolutionists have been embarrassed and ashamed of, like friendship and compassion and care, which stink in our nostrils now because of the bourgeoisie, we can finally indulge in those emotions after the dictatorship of the proletariat, which of course doesn't exactly fully end. So that's what I mean about the affirm. So there's a kind of a phantom limb tendency in avant-garde theory to carry forward some of these little residues of earlier political paradigms and the absolute rejection of kind. And look, there can be a lot of really naive affirmative art practices for sure. I'm the first to say it. But I think it's kind of had the effect of firewalling off of an ability to understand how something that's prefigurative or affirmative can actually be helpful or useful or valuable or creative in a way. So that's just a really quick way to respond to that, because I know we're out of time. But these are great questions.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much to everyone, and also to the great question and the wonderful presentation. Yeah, on 21st of April, we will continue our conversation, and maybe you both then join us, because it's Marc James Léger, and he is the writer of several books, or the author of several books on socially engaged art, and also one of on Vanguardia. And so it kind of connects to what you just discussed. And his talk will be on a gray matter, socially engaged art as professional managerial class. And I'm very much looking forward to it. And he's also among our guests today. So hi, Marc. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a really dense evening, and yeah, happy to meet all of you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.